Oh, really? Yeah.
This is our first program. Our next program will be Tuesday, May 7th. It'll be a presentation by Jeffrey Zygmunt entitled Walking in the Woods with Robert Frost, Seeing Nature Through the Words of America's Most Loved Poet. So it's the first Tuesday in May. Each of these meetings will be the first Tuesday of each month. Tonight's program is entitled Ebenezer Smith, Meredith's Revolutionary Trailblazer. Our presenter is Rudy VanVeghten. Rudy has been a longtime editor of the Meredith News. He's also written a number of books about Meredith, including Three Sons of Liberty, Meredith in the Revolutionary War, A History of Meredith Bay. He's a prime contributor to a book we started last year at the museum called Morsels of History, which we take some of these smaller vignettes that don't make the history pages, and we're going to produce one each year, so there'll be another coming out in probably September. And in September, Rudy, you think? Ebenezer in September? Ebenezer Smith, yeah.
Hopefully by July 2nd when I do the second part of this program.
Oh, okay. Well, he's ambitious. So I think, you know, Ebenezer Smith, without question, is the most influential person in Meredith history. I mean, there's just absolutely no question. An unbelievable guy. He was called the father of the town. And it's great that Rudy has really dug into his history. It's been decades overdue, and we're all looking forward to it. So we'll let Rudy give you a taste of what he's working on.
Okay.
Rudy.
Is that coming through okay? Everything here? A year from now, we're going to be celebrating the beginning of the American Revolution. And that was April 19th of 1775. And that would be the battles of Lexington and Concord. And that got everything going. So when I first moved back to Meredith a few years ago, John Edgar of the Society wanted me to do a program on the Revolutionary War. Well, I said, I got to do some research before I do that. So I got into the research on it. And as I was doing the research, I found a lot of information about Ebenezer Smith. And I said, well, we really ought to do something about him specifically. So that's how this came up. But as you see, I've subtitled this Meredith in the American Revolution, which is part of a series of programs that I'll be giving throughout the years of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And I'll be doing one next year, probably on Bunker Hill, and maybe some of the other battles that occurred in 1775. But this one here, particularly this year, there wasn't much Revolutionary War material, so I thought I would focus on Ebenezer Smith. And I hope you don't mind, I'm going to read my program, otherwise I'll get off on so many tangents, I'll never get out of here. Nor will you. So, Ebenezer Smith's forefathers, like many colonial New Englanders, migrated across the Atlantic during the religious political upheaval of King Charles I's reign. They came from tiny Shropham Parish, located about 30 miles inland from Norwich in East Anglia, a predominantly Puritan area of England. Starting in 1647, the family emigrated to Ipswich, a staunchly Puritan enclave in Massachusetts Bay Colony. Ebenezer's parents, Daniel Smith Jr. and Mary Kimball Smith, were the fourth generation of the family, still living in Ipswich when Ebenezer was born in 1734. Sometime about 1744, the Smiths relocated to Exeter, New Hampshire. Ebenezer was likely about 10 at the time. We can extrapolate from his later life that Ebenezer was the beneficiary of a substantial early education in Ipswich and or in Exeter. In addition to reading and writing, he gained a very good competency in ciphering skills. A lifelong learner, he also came by such talents as milling, surveying, and the basic farming skills important to everyone. In December of 1648, when Ebenezer was nearing his 15th birthday, his father was among a group of 60 residents of Exeter and other southern New Hampshire communities to petition a group known as the Masonian Proprietors, and they petitioned for a township on the north side of the Lake Winnipesaukee outlet. And a few years later, Ebenezer was only 19 and had not yet achieved his majority, that would be 21 years old, when his father died in 1752. As evidenced by his father's will, the greatest part of the Daniel Smith estate devolved to Ebenezer's mother and eldest brother, also named Daniel. Ebenezer and his other siblings each received 10 pounds. And that may not seem like an awful lot, but that's equivalent to about $10,000 today. Well, with a substantial estate to manage in Exeter, Daniel, the eldest Smith sibling, paid little attention to that property his father had bought in the New Hampshire frontier. Other town petitioners, however, gathered on May 3rd of 1754 to draw lots to divide up the township that they were by then calling New Salem. The Daniel Smith share received a First Division lot along the eastern shore of Lake Winnisquam. And if I'm not mistaken, that was this lot right here. So, and he also received parcels in the Second Division, which was over here, and the Third Division, which was over here. But as we'll learn, the Second and Third Divisions were resurveyed a little bit later on. Of more importance were happenings across the American colonies and over in Europe. When the Europeans, what the Europeans call the 7 Years' War, we know as the last of the French and Indian Wars. Hostilities broke out in 1754, and fears of renewed attacks into the New Hampshire frontier stalled settlement efforts until the war's end in the early 1760s. There is some inconclusive evidence that Ebenezer Smith participated in an expedition against Canada during the last stages of the French and Indian War. Provincial government officials received a soldier's petition on January 20th of 1761, in which 23 petitioners reported that they had not received pay for their service in 1759. And among the signers was an Ebenezer Smith. But there's no way of telling whether he's our guy or somebody else with that name. And we do know of one other Ebenezer Smith that came from Durham, and there could have been others as well. My bet it was our guy, but that's me. With the latest war winding down, there was renewed urgency for the 60 New Salem petitioners to begin improving their lots in accordance with the Masonian requirements. On the first day of January 1759, the New Salem town proprietors named Ebenezer Smith and 2 others as assessors. Most of the work would have required visits to shareholders at their homes in Exeter and Hampton and Stratham and a couple of other smaller towns. But logically, it may have also required a reconnaissance trip up here to the grant itself, which might have been Ebenezer's first look at the land that would one day become his own. And in January of 1761, Smith moved up a notch when he moved from tax assessor to tax collector. In what appears to be his first mention in the New Salem ledger books, Ebenezer paid his own 4-pound tax on April 25th of 1761. And I quote from the ledger, "Received of Ebenezer Smith for the last tax of my 2 rights." Now, there's no prior record to which 2 rights these were. Now, a right would include 1 lot in Division 1, 1 in Division 2, and 1 in Division 3. But it would seemingly be the rights of Jacob Longfellow and Samuel Norris Jr., where Smith settled it later. These abutting First Division lots were located at the head of Round Bay, and this right here is Round Bay, and the two lots were this one and cross-court, if I'm looking at it right, would be right up in here. Deed records, however, show that he didn't officially purchase half of one of those lots until October of 1773, and he had purchased the other half of that lot previously, but the deed had not been recorded. For one reason, the Registry of Deeds didn't start going until 1773, so if it was before that, not all the deeds got recorded. 2 months later, on July 6, 1761, Ebenezer and his brother Payne Smith, click here, posted bonds for the drawing of lots in Gilmanton. Now, although it has previously been concluded that Ebenezer chose Meredith only after an earlier preference for Gilmanton, his tax payment of April 1761 argues in favor of his interest in New Salem simultaneously, if not even earlier. Either way, he maintained real estate and development interest in both communities throughout his life. Now, events in his personal life added importance for Ebenezer Smith to do something soon. At some point during 1762, Ebenezer married Sarah Spiller in Exeter. At the proprietor's annual meeting on January 3rd, 1763, you'll notice that a lot of these meetings occur in the first week of January. That's when they had their annual meeting every year. They instructed Smith and a road committee on which he served to look out and clear a good cart road from Gilmanton Road to the Sawmill Grant in New Salem. Well, the Sawmill Grant was down here at the bottom of the peninsula that's between Winnisquam and Paugus Bay. It was the area of present-day Laconia near the old Belknap Mill and the downtown shopping mall. Now, at the same time, town proprietors authorized construction of a sawmill. As a tax collector, Ebenezer Smith was responsible for collecting 30 pounds of tax assessed to each of the town proprietors to pay for the road and the mill combined together. On the home front, Sarah and Ebenezer Smith became parents for the first time on April 24th of 1763, when Sarah gave birth to a son in Exeter. They named him Daniel after Ebenezer's late father. But one of the obstacles facing potential New Salem settlers in the early days was fording the Winnipesaukee River to access their lots. With this in mind, the town proprietors took action at their January 2nd, 1764 meeting and, quote, voted that there be a bridge built over Winnipesaukee River at the Sawmill Grant within 20 months from this date. Ebenezer Smith and 4 others were appointed to see the proprietors' wishes through in building what became known as the Meredith Bridge. Sadly, Sarah and Ebenezer Smith's young son, Daniel, died on April 25th, 1764, at the age of 1 year and 1 day. But not too long after that, Sarah and Ebenezer were still living in Exeter and became parents with the birth of another son on March of 1765 named Ebenezer Jr. And motions toward settlement were now moving at a faster pace. The biggest problem left was to induce pioneers to undertake the hard work of building rustic cabins and clearing land for agriculture. The proprietors had this in mind when they voted to pay £200 each to the first 20 prospective settlers who would clear 6 acres, prepare 3 of those acres for planting, and build a small residence. Ebenezer Smith was among the first to capitalize on this incentive. But one thing that was still needed was a supply of milled lumber for building frame houses as opposed to log cabins. So once the Meredith Bridge was in place, the next item on the priority list was building that sawmill. As described in a book by the local DAR chapter, published about 100 years ago, quote, the ironwork for the sawmill, which is 363 pounds, was transported from Exeter by Ebenezer Smith on horseback, undoubtedly, He did much of the work also. It seems as if there must have been a raising, like a barn raising. And how do they come by that information? Well, in the ledger book, there's an item for 6 gallons of rum. I'm not sure they could saw the lumber in a straight line after that. Financial records show that Smith and others were paid in October for the work on the sawmill during the summer months. Then in January of 1766, the town proprietors awarded Smith and William Meade a 3-year lease for the mill with the right to keep half of the lumber that they sawed for others. Now, Smith soon reported progress on his 2 lots. Using lumber processed through his sawmill, he built his homestead at the head of Lake Opeechee, where he had already cleared nearly 20 acres of land. Now, I don't know if you know what goes into clearing land without a power chainsaw, but you take your axe or your hand saws, and you have to bring down a lot of trees and haul out the roots, so you need to have some oxen on hand. It was quite a job. He had 20 acres cleared out. I'm sure he didn't do it all himself. He had people working for him, but still a lot of work. Well, sometime in 1766, he was finally ready to move his family from Exeter north to New Salem. Gilmanton historian Daniel Lancaster possibly had gleaned information from one of Ebenezer Smith's surviving children when he wrote this in 1845. The journey was accomplished on horseback, and that part of the way which lay through Gilmanton was a path to be followed by spotted trees. Mrs. Smith, not being able to guide a horse herself, took a seat, as was common in those days, behind her husband upon the same horse, and thus mounted with his child in his arms and a favorite little dog in his pocket, he arrived one evening just before sunset. Well, that's a nice little story, but for one thing, I think it was more than a one-day ride getting from Exeter up to here. He probably had to stay 1 or 2 nights in inns along the way. Also, if you remember, he was asked 3 years before this to build a cart path. So it was probably a little bit more than a horse path at that time. Probably wide enough for a cart, so he didn't have to bring all of his stuff in his arms. It was now 17 years since the original township grant, and many of the original petitioners had failed to initiate any improvements on their lots. Ebenezer Smith and 2 others traveled to Portsmouth on March 25th of 1766 to request of the Masonian proprietors, or the original grantees of the property, that the unimproved lots be forfeited and offered to other grantees. So having met his own obligation, of course, Ebenezer Smith and some of the others in town stood to benefit from this measure. Smith and his fellow New Salem settlers had 2 sets of proprietors to keep happy. There was the Masonian oligarchy down in Portsmouth and the group of township petitioners, mostly from Exeter and Hampton. A progress report from September 29th of 1766 showed that there were, at that time, 12 improved lots in New Salem, including those of William Meade, Abraham Folsom, and Ebenezer Smith. Interestingly, 4 of the improved lots were owned by Smith. His own lot, with 23 acres of the trees had been cut down, and 18 acres cleared, with 2 houses and a barn built. And in addition, the report showed that Smith owned lots that were worked by George Bean, Job Judkins, and Thomas Danford. Now you think about that, if he's getting 200 pounds for each lot that is developed, he's got 200 pounds times 4. So he really cleaned up on that deal, and probably even more than that. With settlers now putting down roots in New Salem, the population continued to grow, not only with new pioneers moving in, but also through the enlargement of settled families. Tamer, daughter of Jacob Eden, was born on March 11th of 1767, followed 4 months later by Daniel, son of Ebenezer and Sarah Smith, born on July 4th, 1767. Now, this Daniel, you'll notice, the first child was also named Daniel, but it wasn't unusual for parents to name a second child if the first one had died, to repeat that name. As related by former Meredith Historical Society President Solon Colby, quote, "It was generally understood that the proprietors would present 250 acres of land to the first child born in town. But Ebenezer Smith claimed that the right of land was to the first male child." And in the end, Tamer received 50 acres, and Ebenezer Smith's son Daniel received 200 acres. It was more than 2 decades later, however, before Daniel Smith, then a young man of 24, claimed that acreage. Well, by the summer of 1768, another handful of families had moved to New Salem, and most of the settlement was in the First Division area of Meredith Bridge, Lake Village, the Great Wares, and the land near Ebenezer Smith's homestead at Lake Opeechee. And feeling that they were now ready for the next stage in their development, the proprietors sent Ebenezer Smith and David Lawrence down to Portsmouth to present a petition to Governor John Wentworth and the provincial legislature. And I quote, "The proprietors and inhabitants of New Salem show that 17 families have actually settled and are now resident in New Salem, and 4 other families are preparing to go and reside there," end quote. This showed, they claimed, that they are ripe for an incorporation. Well, it took several months for Governor Wentworth to rule on the petition, but when he approved the incorporation request on December 30th of 1768, he caught the residents of New Salem off guard by changing the name of their town to Meredith, after his acquaintance and political ally, Sir William Meredith, over in England. Several months later, town voters reimbursed Smith for his efforts procuring the incorporation. So that was my topic of last year when I spoke on the naming of Meredith and how that came to be. Well, one of the principal advantages of incorporation was allowing the residents to set up a municipal government, giving the settlers control locally rather than relying on a distinct group of proprietors. With Puritan-based town meeting government now established, Meredith's first town meeting was held on March 20th, 1769, at Ebenezer Smith's home. And this is a sketch that was drawn in 1768 by Ruth Colby of Meredith up here for the town's bicentennial, and it shows one of those early town meetings at Ebenezer Smith's home. Now, early town records indicate that in addition to his home being large enough for such meetings, Smith actually ran a hostelry there. He is frequently referred to as Ebenezer Smith Innkeeper during the first several years of the town's incorporation. Well, votes of the 20 or so residents attending in that first town meeting resulted in electing Ebenezer Smith as their town clerk, so he was the one keeping the records, as well as one of the 3 town selectmen. And Smith continued to hold office as selectman for all but one of the next 36 years. And that one year is actually pretty interesting, and I'll be talking about that on July 2nd for the second part of this series on Ebenezer Smith. Now, as previously noted, the first road built in Meredith was a path built by Ebenezer Smith and others in 1762 and 63 to gain access as far north as the planned town square. That first road extended across the river at today's downtown Laconia and continued north up Pleasant Street, Old North Main Street, and Parade Road, which is now Route 106. This section of the road became part of a more ambitious road building project that stretched from the Great Bay in Durham to the northern Connecticut River Valley, and this became known as the Province Road, but it didn't really get started until John Wentworth became governor. Rather than expend provincial tax revenue for this road, the government passed along the work and the expense to the towns along the route who would benefit from the road. Meredith town proprietors on June 13th of 1769, quote, voted Ebenezer Smith, Mr. William Meade, and Mr. Abram Folsom, Jr., a committee to clear the province road through the town, and that each proprietor of the said town have liberty to work their proportion in clearing said road. So in other words, they could do actual physical work on the road instead of paying a tax to pay others to do it. The path of the road through Meredith still exists today. If we continue up Parade Road, it bends up Pease Road and Winona Road and crosses into New Hampton and continues north up to Plymouth and then northeast to Haverhill, New Hampshire along the Baker River Valley, what we now call the Tenny Mountain Highway. It was a different story in neighboring Gilmanton. Voters there refused to build their proportion, and instead the provincial government had the job, bid the job out and charged Gilmanton a tax of over £300 to pay for it. Well, some of that land in Gilmanton was still owned by the Masonian proprietors. And to finance the Masonian share of the road assessment, the town proprietors, quote, voted to sell so much public land as would meet the expense, and that Ebenezer Smith, Esquire, and Antipas Gilman be a committee to sell the same. Well, when some of the land was auctioned off, guess who? Ebenezer Smith ended up being the winning bidder. Other important roads in early Meredith included one starting at the Province Road near Smith's house and running to the section that became known as Lake Village, today we call it Lakeport, where settler Abraham Folsom and his son developed a mill site that eventually replaced the original sawmill at Meredith Bridge. Today we know that road as Elm Street. Ebenezer Smith was the town's head selectman in 1773, when the board also approved the layout of a new road providing access to the 3rd division of lots that eventually evolved into today's Route 25 from the downtown traffic lights up the high school hill and then following the old Center Harbor Road to the Moultonborough town line. And over in the west end of town, talk about a road from Sanbornton Bridge to New Holderness. Sanbornton Bridge is now Tilton and New Holderness is now Ashland. That talk started as early as 1765, but nothing much happened over the next decade. This road, when built in the late 1770s, crossed through Meredith's 2nd Division along the present-day Saddle Hill Road and Edgerly School Road before entering New Hampton near the land of Samuel Kelly. Now, Samuel Kelly was an early settler just over the line into New Hampton, who later built the Dana Meeting House, which still stands over there. And a couple of interesting notes about the road. Ebenezer's brother Payne Smith developed property near there, actually on the west side of that road. And Ebenezer's daughter Mary, nicknamed Polly, later married Samuel Kelly's son, William. So nice having that road there where you can get your daughter to hook up with the top settler over in another town. New Salem's proprietors had expansion in mind when in June of 1768 they named Ebenezer Smith and others to lay out the 2nd and 3rd divisions of lots in said township. Over the next 2 years, Smith and Joshua Sandbon drew a new plan of the town that renumbered the lots in the 2 divisions. Lots in Division 2 ended up being 120 acres each, and lots in Division 3 ended up being 95 acres each. And again, this area over here and extending up into here is the 2nd Division, and the 3rd Division, this is the layout that they surveyed. 3rd Division is here and extends some, these are called amendment lots down here, going a little bit into what was previously the 1st Division. Over the next 2 years, I got that one already, so let's go on. After receiving approval of their plan from the town proprietors in Exeter, Smith and Sandbon traveled to Portsmouth to present the plan to the Masonian proprietors, who approved it on December 12th of 1770. Now, although approving the plan, they noticed a large chunk of land that was undivided between Lake Waukesha and Pemigewasset. So that's this area up in here. It's all white or all undivided here. In order to rectify this, they voted directions to Colonel Smith concerning the undivided lands in Meredith to run the same out and draw for them. In other words, survey that land and then divide it up among the proprietors, the town proprietors. This eventually became known in some sources as a 4th division. Obviously not as big as the other divisions. Demonstrating Ebenezer Smith's, I think I'm one more down there. Demonstrating Ebenezer Smith's spreading reputation as a surveyor was a job he got hired for in 1771 to help survey land along the Saco River in the town of Albany. So his name is getting out there. That's actually quite a ways away from Meredith when you don't have cars or something to get over there. Well, in granting the land that evolved into Meredith, the Masonian proprietors laid the groundwork for the religious needs of the settlers. They did this by reserving a lot share for the first minister of the gospel who shall be settled on the said land, and another lot for and towards the support of the gospel ministry, both of which were to be laid out near the place where the meeting house shall be built. Well, this meeting house that they asked for should be fit for the public worship of God for the use of the inhabitants within 10 years from this time, and maintain the preaching of the gospel there constantly. Well, if the town was granted in 1748, 10 years would have been 1758, and we're already almost up to 1778, so it didn't get done quite as quickly as they wanted to. Not specified in the grant is what religious denomination was required. That left the important decision up to the settlers. Well, a lot of the settlers were descended from the New England Puritans, and they tended to be Calvinist in their faith. The official Puritan faith that evolved into the Congregational Church preferred college-educated ministers in their pulpits. But frontier colonists had difficulty obtaining ministers of this quality, both because there weren't enough to go around, and even more because the college graduates preferred working in urban centers rather than in backwater townships like New Salem. So one of the offshoots of Puritanism, the Baptists, they solved this by relying on their church elders. These were homegrown lay people who had a talent for delivering weekly lessons and sermons. Early Meredith had such a person. His name was Nicholas Carr Folsom, a distant cousin of Miller Abraham Folsom. He moved to Meredith in 1768 and is listed in 1770 as living on the 1st Division Lot 11 in the 4th Range, a lot not surprisingly belonging to and abutting the homestead farm of Ebenezer Smith. Remember when I said his first 2 lots were this one here, which is actually a point lot. Everything down below here were called point lots. And cross corner, abutting it on the corner up here, was this lot here, lot 11, which was in the 4th Range. 4th Range would have gone up here towards Meredith Village, and this would have been the 3rd Range, and there's a couple more up to the side here. The following story is related in the DAR's book on Old Meredith and vicinity. Quote, "The farm where he lived and died was given to him by Ebenezer Smith, Esquire, early after coming to town. Mr. Smith thought a great deal of Mr. Folsom and induced him to settle in Meredith, saying, 'I own all this land about here, and you pick out just the place you like, and I will give it to you.' Well, whether the story is real or apocryphal is unknown, but deed records do show that Folsom purchased a 23 and a half acre lot from Ebenezer Smith in the summer of 1770, but he only paid £5 for it, so it was quite a deal that he got. He almost gave it to him, but not quite. Meredith's First Baptist congregation formed into a church in 1779 with Nicholas Carr Folsom and Abraham Swain chosen as ruling elders. Town residents were certainly anxious to have religious support, and it is apparent that Nicholas Folsom built up some sort of a reputation as a fill-in minister for a number of years. In fact, he had a nickname as Priest Folsom, even though I don't think he'd appreciate being called a priest. But In 1782, it was voted after a season of prayer and fasting to set apart Nicholas Folsom to the work of the Christian ministry. And some residents in town thought it proper to consider Elder Nicholas Folsom as their settled minister in order to meet the Masonian requirements. But the town's Puritan majority blocked the effort. And I quote, "He was generally respected, but the voters objected to his doctrinal views," according to one account. At the same time, the town was perfectly willing to rely on Folsom's ministerial efforts for another 10 years before an officially settled congregational minister agreed to move to town in 1792. And again, we'll take a closer look at that in the second lecture in July about how that congregational minister first came to town. Now, New Hampshire wasn't divided into counties until 1771, when King George III finally approved Governor John Wentworth's plan to establish 5 county governments. Stratford County, in that original division, included Meredith and other towns that later became part of Belknap County. It took another couple of years for the 5 counties to set up their governmental structure, and it was at this time that Meredith Ebenezer Smith became one of Stratford County's justices of the peace, responsible back then for trying criminal cases. And I believe he was also a justice of the peace before that, but before they were divided up into 5 counties, it was basically all just one county, which became Rockingham County, actually. Now, it was also during this time that the first Stratford County Register of Deeds began recording property transfers in the county's towns. Taking advantage, Ebenezer Smith brought in older deed documents to the registry for official recording. The first 10 pages of the Stratford County deed records are crowded with deed transactions involving Ebenezer Smith of Meredith. Well, with the town now settled and incorporated, deed records indicate that Ebenezer Smith, in addition to employment as a road and bridge builder and surveyor, he was actively involved in the profitable business of land speculation. Something, by the way, which was very popular among some other people you might have heard of, like George Washington. He was really big into land speculation. He was in the perfect position, both financially and politically, to take advantage of many profitable transactions, buying up property at public auction for bargain prices and later turning them around for profit. Recall that Smith had used that method to buy that property in Gilmanton. And he used that, bought other property in Gilmanton and in Meredith at public auction for low prices and sold them high. But not always high. We'll get into that. Smith was also in a financial position to buy up unimproved lots from delinquent proprietors and turn them around for a profit. In November of 1771, Smith purchased from Abner Dolliff of Exeter half of the original right of John Permont for £2, 14 shillings. You know, keep in mind that one right of the original town proprietors included 3 lots, one in each of the town's 3 divisions. By this purchase, Smith held title to roughly 50 acres in each of the 3 lots colored red on this slide. 2 months later, he tracked down John Permont's son and bought the other half of the lots for even less, only £1, 2 shillings. I'm sorry, £1, 7 shillings. For a little more than £4, Ebenezer Smith had acquired nearly 300 acres of land. Now, you know, the Occupy Wall Street crowd might condemn Smith for being so successful, but before we get too critical, let's dig a little deeper. Mary Neal Hannaford claims in her Annals and Genealogies that Smith, quote, was called the father of the poor people, as he helped them any way he could in the new country. And in their book, the DAR said of Smith, many families settled on land owned by Ebenezer Smith. He would help a man at first and sell him the land later. Well, so like those others that I pointed out earlier, he would let somebody build a farm and cultivate the land on a property that he owned, and then as they started making a profit, they could buy that from him, and usually at a pretty low rate, unless they were well-to-do, and then he would charge more. So. Now, following the deed trail of that Permont right, cited above gives us a typical example. In early July of 1777, Abraham Swain was a corporal in a company of volunteers in the Revolutionary War. And less than 2 weeks after returning to Meredith, Ebenezer Smith sold him all of the 1st Division Paramount lot, and 2/3 of the 2nd Division lot, over 150 acres in all, and the price tag was £12. By comparison, in 1801, Smith sold the 95-acre 3rd Division Paramount lot for $250. So again, the 3 lots up here, this was the one that he sold for $250, which is one that was hard to get at back in those days. And I think that this is the one that, and half of this one, that he sold for less to Abraham Swain. Over the years, in lieu of the existence of a local finance institution, Smith also assisted local farmers by issuing mortgage deeds and allowing them to pay them off over time. Well, there was one level of public service missing from Ebenezer Smith's resume at this point, and that would be representation in the provincial government. Such representation was at that time not open to all incorporated towns, only those invited by the existing provincial government that was tightly controlled by the Wentworth family. Many frontier settlements, like Meredith, had not yet been granted this privilege. This was the case as events in Portsmouth, Boston, and other locations in the American colonies began spiraling toward a separation from Mother England. Events like the Stamp Act riot in Portsmouth in 1765, the Boston Massacre in 1770, and the Boston Tea Party in 1773. When Governor John Wentworth dissolved his sitting provincial legislature in Portsmouth in June of 1774, representatives elected by communities across the state responded by calling their own legislative sessions in Exeter. Well, 2 days after the first shots of the impending war, this rogue legislature in Exeter gathered for its 3rd Provincial Congress on April 21st, 1775. One key decision made was to expand its membership and include representatives from all of the settled towns in the province. They sent out requests to the towns. They were called precepts. And these were like orders to hold elections for what they called deputies, which was their word for representatives. Meredith selectmen received their request a few days later and gathered voters together on May 15th to elect their first state representative. As recorded in the meeting minutes, quote, voted Ebenezer Smith, Esquire of said town, a deputy to meet and set with other deputies from the other towns in said province. And in addition, the town voted to purchase 10 rifles, a barrel of gunpowder, bullets, and flints in order to arm 10 Meredith soldiers to march to Massachusetts and join the gathering American army. For the first time, Ebenezer Smith saddled his horse and started the long ride down to Exeter to represent Meredith in the provincial, eventually state government. Instead of a near-exclusive focus on his hometown, he, like many others up and down the Atlantic seaboard, now had the weight of a new nation on his shoulders. Well, records from the 4th Provincial Congress that met starting in May 17th of 1775 in Exeter show that Ebenezer Smith was in attendance. And that Congress met not only in May, but they adjourned a couple of times, reconvening in August and again in October. One adopted measure directed each town to conduct a census. And Meredith's return, that was supervised by Ebenezer Smith, reported that there were 60 males in the town between the ages of 16 and 50, 10 of whom had already reported for duty. There were 70 males under the age of 16, 7 males older than 50, and 122 females in all, and no slaves. As the October session extended into November, the legislature also recognized that with the recent departure of Governor John Wentworth, they needed to quickly address the need for a new government structure to replace the previous English one. To accomplish this, the legislature set up a committee to, quote, frame and bring in a plan for the future representation of the people of the colony. And among the members of this 14-person committee was Ebenezer Smith of Meredith. So he's a brand new legislator down there. There's about 80 to 90 in all. And he's selected for a very important committee down there, probably on the basis of his previous experience as a justice of the peace. So he was a judge. And justices of the peace back then, you know, now we think of them as people who can marry somebody. Well, they could do that, but they also were trial judges for criminal matters. So it was a little bit more important than what we now think of as justice of the peace. Now, working quickly, the committee came back with its recommended method for representation. And among the provisions was that every legal inhabitant paying taxes shall be a voter. Now, Sanbornton and Meredith were grouped as a district allowed to elect one representative. And Sanbornton, then being the larger town, elections were held there. When the 5th Provincial Congress gathered in Exeter on December 21st, the recorded roll of attending members shows the results of the representative elections for local towns. Voters again chose Ebenezer Smith to represent Meredith and Sanbornton. On December 27th of 1775, the body, in its most consequential action, voted that this Congress will take up government in such mode and form as this Congress shall heretofore think fit. And it was only 9 days later, on January 5th, 1776, that Ebenezer Smith and the other delegates put in place New Hampshire's first democratically formed constitutional government. And it was the first such form of government anywhere in the 13 colonies. The first one. So, with the onset of war, the 13 original colonies were able to quickly field an army because of the earlier existence of militias. There is no documentation on Meredith's local unit of militia prior to the American Revolution, but it is certain that there was one. And I'll show you how. Back in 1771, Governor Wentworth had put in place measures to improve militia units across the province. He was, of course, relying on local militias remaining loyal to the crown. That didn't work. There were a dozen or so regional regiments of militia across the province, each composed of individual community companies. And as it turned out, loyalties over the next few years turned decidedly against the crown. But thanks to Governor Wentworth's earlier diligence, the militia structure was already in place. Thanks, John. Once hostilities broke out in April of 1775, New Hampshire's Provincial Congress voted that it be recommended to the several towns, parishes, and places in their province to engage as many men in each town as they think fit to be properly equipped and ready to march at a minute's warning on any emergency. So, of course, this is how we get the term Minutemen, which came through both in New Hampshire and in Massachusetts. Reconvening in August, the New Hampshire lawmakers voted that all men in this colony from 16 to 50 years of age be formed into regiments and companies according to the recommendation of the Continental Congress. Continental Congress was the Congress that was meeting down in Philadelphia with delegates from all of the 13 colonies. Additionally, they specified that the regiments or battalions of militia in this colony consist of the same limits as when last commissioned. Now, when were they last commissioned? That was under John Wentworth, who was set about to improve the militias. So that gives us some proof of their earlier existence. In most cases, the existing officers continued in their previous ranks, except where an individual demonstrated loyalist tendencies. When the Congress reconvened in August, the lawmakers voted that Colonel Joseph Badger of Gilmanton be appointed colonel of the regiment of militia lately commanded by himself, and Ebenezer Smith, Esquire, his lieutenant colonel. Well, another list identifies our local regiment as the 10th New Hampshire Regiment, led in addition to Badger and Smith by Bradbury Richardson of Moultonborough as second major, and 4 junior officers in the 4th Company, and that 4th Company was from Meredith, that included Captain Joshua Crockett, 1st Lieutenant John Kimball, 2nd Lieutenant William Ray, and Ensign Robert Bryant. And these are, of course, 4 of our very early settlers. Now, when New Hampshire learned about the capture of Fort Ticonderoga by American patriots in May of 1775, there was a general sigh of relief. The status of the fort had changed with the end of the French and Indian War in the 1760s. The Aboriginal cultures of the Northeast were now loyal to the British rather than to the French. If Mother England was now going to be the Americans' enemy, did that mean another wave of Indian raids on the frontier villages of the American colonies? Well, the importance of keeping Ticonderoga was proven when the American Army failed to capture Quebec in the winter of 1775 and 76. And they were forced to retreat first to Crown Point and then to Fort Ticonderoga, both on Lake Champlain. Staging from Ticonderoga in the fall of 76, the Americans held back the British at the Battle of Valcour Island, after which Canadian Governor Carleton retreated back to Quebec. And so there's something interesting here about Fort Ticonderoga. We can see it right in here. And when it was built by the French, it was called Fort Caroline when the French built it, and it faces south instead of north. And that's because the French were worried about the English coming up from the southern part of the lake, but they weren't worried about other Frenchmen coming down from here. Now it had all switched around, and they realized that Fort Ticonderoga was not going to be sufficient to, you couldn't really see through there to fire on the British ships that they were coming down. So what they did is they built another fort over here across the lake called Mount Independence. And they had a fort here and a battery here, which faced directly up there. And that's what succeeded in when Carleton came down in the spring of, the fall of 1776. He saw those battlements there, and he just turned around and says, "We'll do something next year. It's too late this year to do anything." So it all worked out for the best. Well, Meredith and New Hampshire sensed what was to come. And in March of 1777, the state legislature issued troop quotas for the state's towns to raise and send west to Fort Ticonderoga. And in response to the call for enlistments, 50 Meredith residents turned out to a special town meeting at Ebenezer Smith's home. And they all signed their names at this meeting. So Ebenezer Smith, Joshua Crockett, and John Gilman were assigned to be a committee tasked with raising the town's quota of 5 enlistees. Additionally, voters approved a bounty of £10 to help spur enlistments. Well, when fair weather returned in 1777, it wasn't Carleton at the head of the new British advance. It was British General John Burgoyne. And he had convinced the English government to put him in charge, and he wasted no time in outfitting a large army consisting of British regulars, Hessian mercenaries, Canadian militiamen, and what the Americans feared the most, Native Americans. By the time the New Hampshire Congress reconvened in Exeter in June 4th, 1777, Burgoyne was preparing forces to move south into Lake Champlain. Now, in late June of 1777, American General Philip Schuyler over in New York sent a desperate letter to the New Hampshire and Massachusetts governments requesting their militia support. Our garrison at Ticonderoga is greatly inadequate to the defense of the expensive works on both sides of the lake, and I have unhappily no troops here to reinforce them. That's what Schuyler wrote. And as word of Burgoyne's advance spread rapidly across New Hampshire, local militia units sprang into action. Colonel Joseph Badger, who was commander of the 10th Militia Regiment, wrote from his home in Gilmanton on July 5th to Lieutenant Colonel Ebenezer Smith in Meredith. "Sir, I have received no orders to march any man which I think strange. But as the matter of saving Ticonderoga is of so much importance, if you can send a company of men immediately under proper officers, or as many as you can, I should advise so to do, and to march until you can find whether they are wanted or not. I should be glad if you go yourself, if you can. Well, ironically, it was that same day, July 5th, that Burgoyne and the British captured Fort Ticonderoga and sent the Americans into full retreat across the lake and over Mount Independence. And unaware of the news from the west, Smith set out on July 7th for Fort No. 4 in Charlestown, and from there to continue west of Fort Ticonderoga. Smith served as the company's commanding officer. Unfortunately, it was too little, too late. Correspondence from Smith indicates that his 45-man company didn't all march together from home. And I quote, "Sangerton raised 16 men, Meredith 15, and Moultonborough 10, who all joined me at Unity." Now, Unity is located about 7 miles northeast of Charlestown. And it was here that Colonel Smith and his men first learned that Fort Ticonderoga had been captured. Smith wrote to New Hampshire's Committee of Safety, "There I met Colonel Garish and Major Batchelder, who informed that Ticonderoga was lost." Other militia officers advised that they should return home, but Ebenezer Smith was hesitant, writing, "Seeing confusion and distress of the inhabitants and the defenseless state of the inhabitants, and the need there was to take some care of the same above the river," so the communities that lived north on the Connecticut River. "I advised Colonel Garish and Major Batchelder to stop what men they could and join me and tarry until we could have advice from you or the general." The general was Nathaniel Folsom. "And I ordered in my men to stand fast." His pleading fell on deaf ears as more reports drifted in from pent American soldiers separated from their various units. Quote, "There's nothing but confusion here. Some saying one thing, some another. The men coming in with various reports from Tyke," love that nickname, "some Continental and some militia." He finally acquiesced to the other officers and informed the Committee of Safety, "I am on my return with my men, but I hope the great loss we have met with will not discourage in the least from using the best endeavors in our own defense that you and your great wisdom can advise, and that speedily." Well, by July 23rd, 1777, Colonel Smith and his troops were back home. Well, following Smith's return home, the New Hampshire legislature promoted John Stark, I'm sure you've all heard of him, promoted him to brigadier general and sent him with a hastily formed brigade to assist the desperate American army in slowing the British advance. 17 militiamen from Meredith joined the brigade and participated in Stark's victory at the Battle of Bennington in August. Ebenezer Smith's next entry in the record comes with his attendance at the next legislative session in Exeter on September 17, 1777. And whatever gratification the legislatures in Exeter felt over Stark's victory at Bennington was tempered by a letter that Stark wrote from Stillwater, New York. His brigade's enlistment terms were done, and the soldiers, including the 17 men from Meredith, were heading back home to take care of their harvest. Well, without a brigade to command, Stark also headed back to New Hampshire to help enlist fresh recruits. And one day after writing his letter and leaving for home, that was the day the Americans and the British met for the first Battle of Saratoga, also known as the Battle of Freeman's Farm. That battle ended in a stalemate. Ebenezer Smith and the other delegates at the State General Court adjourned their legislative session on September 27th. But Ebenezer didn't return home to Meredith. Instead, he answered the call to the war effort once again. Even though he held the rank of lieutenant colonel in the state's 10th Militia Regiment, he signed up on September 30th as a first major in the regiment of Colonel Joseph Welch of Plastow and headed west to join the American Army at Saratoga. Well, Ebenezer Smith and Welch's regiment were part of a brigade that was led by New Hampshire General William Whipple that saw, quote, meritorious conduct at the October 7th Battle of Bemis Heights. Overall, it was a watershed moment for the American Army as it defeated Burgoyne and forced his retreat to the north. Well, before he could complete his escape, Burgoyne's retreat was stopped by none other than General John Stark, who had somehow returned with a fresh brigade and set up a blockade that forced Burgoyne's surrender on October 17th. General Whipple was present at the surrender and part of the American team that drafted terms of capitulation for Burgoyne's surrender. And it's just possible that if General Whipple was there, that his brigade was also there, which means that Ebenezer Smith may have been present during the surrender of Burgoyne, which was basically the turning point of the American Revolution. Ebenezer Smith was discharged from that enlistment on November 5, 3 weeks following the Americans' game-changing victory over the British Army. He was back attending a legislative session in Exeter on November 10th, at which time he took an oath of allegiance to the state of New Hampshire and, quote, to defend the independence of the United States of America. Okay, well, Ebenezer Smith was once again present when the General Court convened on December 17th in Exeter. And one significant matter facing the delegates then was receipt of a communication from the Continental Congress to review and debate what they called the Articles of Confederation. They were designed to form a perpetual union between the 13 states. Delaying a vote for the time, the legislature decided to send copies throughout the state that every person may give their sentiment thereon. When the legislative session adjourned on January 3rd, 1778, Ebenezer Smith no doubt carried a copy of these articles in his saddlebags on the cold ride back home. Upon his return, Smith put his selectman's hat back on and called a special town meeting on January 26. Voters chose William Meade, John Folsom, and Ebenezer Smith as a committee, quote, to give instructions to the representative of said Meredith and Samberton. Well, that's kind of strange. Ebenezer Smith was that representative, so he was in a position of being on a committee to give instructions to himself on whether or not to approve the Articles of Confederation. Ebenezer was back in Exeter on February 11th for the second session of the State General Court. The delegates approved the Articles of Confederation on February 25th, and it is significant that now the new country had at least a skeleton framework for operating a government. Meredith's annual town meeting in 1778 was held April 6th. One significant issue discussed during the meeting was the matter of the town's name. Recall that a decade earlier, Governor John Wentworth had usurped the town's preferred name of New Salem and incorporated it as Meredith. Now, with Wentworth and the British meddlers out of the way, townsfolk felt that it was time to change their name back to what they wanted in the first place. As recorded in the meeting minutes, quote, voted to petition the General Court to have the name of the town of Meredith altered to the former name that said town was called, by which was New Salem. They tasked their representative, Ebenezer Smith, to pursue the matter. Well, that task never came to fruition. There is nothing in the legislative journals of the time that indicate that Rep. Smith ever introduced a bill to request the change. And we'll probably never know a complete explanation of why, but there are two possibilities. One, from the early 1770s, several references to the southern town of Salem called themselves instead New Salem. In fact, there are maps that show New Salem being the name of what we now know as Salem, and another New Salem on the same map, what we now call Meredith. With Salem laying claim to the name, the legislature never took up the matter, and of course we have retained the name of Meredith ever since. So that's one theory. A second theory comes from my friend Merrill Fay over here, who last year, when I talked about the naming of Meredith, brought this to my attention. He believes that Smith, although clearly on the side of the Patriots during the war, retained some level of respect for the previous government of Governor John Wentworth, and he deliberately let the matter die. Now, there is certainly some evidence to support Mr. Fay's theory. Factionalism was already seeping into American politics, even at the local level. A sizable contingent was very hesitant to centralize any level of national government. They came to be known as anti-federalists. This is quite likely the reason that Meredith voters named a committee to instruct Representative Smith how to vote on the Articles of Confederation. They simply didn't trust him to vote the way they wanted him to, without giving him specific instructions. A decade later, Smith, a Federalist, by the way, again failed to follow the instructions of his anti-Federalist constituents to vote against adoption of a new United States Constitution. And it is very possible that this factionalism also caused Smith's lack of effort in changing the town's name. So basically, Federalists tend to be more sympathetic to the previous government, the English government, and they styled a lot of the Constitution, the Federalists who wrote the Constitution, on a lot of the English system. So there was a lot of respect, not for the people that were there, the generals and so forth, that took away their liberty, but for the system of government that they had. So, kind of going along with you, Merrill, on that. We'll talk a little bit more about that during the Constitutional Convention later on. Now, New Hampshire's first form of government, adopted on, well, let me skip that part because I'm running late. There are a couple more Revolutionary War matters before we call it quits for tonight. The first involves Ebenezer Smith's military rank during the period. At the war's start, Smith served as lieutenant colonel of the 10th New Hampshire Regiment. With settlement into the frontier increasing following Saratoga, the state legislature in November of 1780 decided to split the 10th Regiment into two separate units. Retaining the designation of the 10th Regiment, the new arrangement included the towns of Gilmanton, Sanverton, Meredith, New Hampton, Barnstead, New Durham, and New Durham Gore, which is now Alton. Former regimental commander Joseph Badger had already been previously promoted to brigadier general in June of that year, and the legislature now promoted Lieutenant Colonel Ebenezer Smith, quote, for the first colonel of the 10th Regiment. The new regiment, numbered 19, included the towns of Wakefield, Middleton, Wolfboro, Effingham, Moultonboro, Tuftonboro, Sandwich, Tamworth, Ossipee, Gore, Eaton, and Conway. The legislature promoted Major Bradbury Richardson of Moultonboro to the rank of colonel of the new 19th New Hampshire Militia Regiment. Well, Ebenezer Smith remained active in the militia for the next several years. On June 23rd of 1786, then Governor John Sullivan, he was actually called president, but they didn't change that from president to governor until a little later. So John Sullivan and his council nominated Colonel Smith, as well as Colonel Theophilus Dame and Colonel Thomas Bartlett, for one opening position as Brigadier General. Well, as it turned out, Colonel Bartlett won that appointment, and Ebenezer Smith was out of consideration. Well, possibly as a result of this, Ebenezer Smith on September 17th of 1787, he's now 52 years old, he stepped down from his leadership role in the 10th New Hampshire. And he was replaced by Joseph Badger Jr. of Gilmanton as colonel, with Richard Sinclair of Meredith taking over as his lieutenant colonel. Now, although his resignation seemingly marked the end of Ebenezer Smith's military career, his past service was recognized one more time. On February 7th of 1793, Governor Josiah Bartlett and his executive council needed a new major general for the state's ongoing militia administration. Councilors advanced only two nominees, Brigadier General Moses Dow of Haverhill and Colonel Ebenezer Smith of Meredith. Once again, Colonel Smith lost out, and General Dow received the promotion. But that's a pretty good feather in his cap to be nominated twice to become a general in the state militia. And the image here shows not Ebenezer Smith, but the uniform of a militia colonel. So, in conclusion, I hope that I have demonstrated tonight, as John said at the beginning, that there was no one more important to the story of Meredith settlement, incorporation, and local contributions to the Revolutionary War than Ebenezer Smith. As you might expect, his story doesn't end there. Part 2 of this biography will explore how our town's founding father also deserves a place in the pantheon of state and national founding fathers as well. And that talk is scheduled for Tuesday, July 2nd. In the meantime, as John mentioned, on May 7th, our next program will feature a talk by Jeffrey Zigmont talking about one of our historic poets in New Hampshire that we probably all studied in anthologies in our English classes in high school, Robert Frost. And I think that's going to be a great program. I hope you can all attend. So that's it for me tonight.